Right. Okay. So today I've got a short story about data management in Rails applications. Obviously, in this case, I do not mean like managing the data by the app, but by ourselves as developers. For example, preparing some seed data or this sort of things, or actually managing schema as well. So this will be just a short summary of the tools that we have by default that are provided by the framework and some external gems or something, right? So the problem that I have faced with one of the coders recently is where should the given code be placed? It's like the most common problem in programming after all, right? So we had some seeding stuff that was placed in a migration. So I thought, well, maybe it's not clear for everybody where to put the actual code that interacts with our database and with its schema. So hence this presentation. So the first thing that we usually use when starting a new Rails application or anything that actually takes advantage of migrations is the actual migration, right? So what are migrations for? So if you are introducing a new migration, we should focus only for it to modify our schema, right? We shouldn't use migrations to populate our database with some records or anything like that. It's fair to install new extensions for PostgreSQL. It's okay to add new database views. It's okay to add or modify tables, etc., but not for anything that actually introduces new data into the database. So there's another thing that we might consider when we are working for a long time with a given project. Usually it grows. I mean, the list of migration grows a lot. So you got like a couple of hundred even for a long-running applications, right? So you might ask yourself, can I delete it, right? Can I delete all those migrations? And in my opinion, if it's already covered in some dump file like structure SQL or schema RB that are usually within our project, I think it is safe to remove all the migrations and clean up a project a bit, especially if in the lifetime of a project there were some irreversible migrations that will virtually prevent us from going back a certain amount of steps. And basically, how many times do we actually revert many migrations back? It doesn't happen very often. So if you feel that you might have a chance to remove some of those that are really old, then maybe it's okay to do it. At least I think so. Yeah, and there's another thing. When you're working on a given feature and you add a new migration to your repository, and by any chance somebody else is working on this part of application with you, and if you have actually pushed this migration to the remote, and there is a chance that somebody pulled it from there, please do not modify it in place. Because it actually causes problems for the other developer when you change your code in a migration and then he already ran it, but the schema is actually different, right? So whenever you have pushed your migration to a remote that somebody is taking is working with, then just amend it with a new migration instead. Later on, you probably will delete both on this cleanup stage that I have mentioned a bit before. And migrations are classes. They are just not like some scripts that run out of the blue. So there is a question if we should test them. But why are we adding migrations? Because our tests that we prepared for a given part or of application or a given functionality actually probably drove us to the place when we need something new, something changed in a database. So the fact that the migration is there, that it actually does that, is implicitly tested by the feature specs or maybe unit specs as well. So I don't think we should bother testing the migration classes themselves. Next thing is seeding, right? So seeds file. Seeds, well, it should be used to fill database with some initial data. It doesn't mean that we should only run it when the project starts or when we set up a new deployment or something, but also when we introduce a new model and we would like to, for example, add categories to our e-commerce site, and we would like to have a well, this first initial set of categories, we can obviously put it into seeds file and run it at later stage of product development. And obviously, we often use seeds for seeding some development data. We do not want to end up or start with an application that actually is blank and just fill it in manually every time, at least in most cases. So in this case, we should differentiate between development and production data. And in my opinion, it is a good idea to put those scripts into separate files. Because then you can easily test it. You can test if the actual seeds file differentiates between two environments, and test each behavior in each separate scope. And I think it's helpful. So in this case, my seed file usually looks like that. So there is just a subdirectory in the DB that contains all the seeds for different environments that I use. And then if it is a development environment, I just use this service object-like class that loads development seeds for me. And every time I use this production call thing, because it usually seeds me with some very basic data that I will use in development environment after all anyway, right? So what else? Sometimes it is beneficial to use factories, especially when seeding development data. So if you use fabrication or factory girl, just require it and unleash the power of it. Just add records using it, because it's much easier, isn't it? Yeah, and this is this fancy word I like, idempotent. So make seeding scripts idempotent. I don't even know if I spelled it correctly, but pronounce it, sorry. The thing is that you should make your scripts in a way that you can run them multiple times and the result doesn't change. So for example, if you have created an initial set of categories, when you run those seeds files, again, they should not be recreated. I'm not saying that they not should be duplicated, but even recreated, because, for example, the IDs may change. So if a given part of your seed file have already been applied, let's make sure that it's not reapplied when we run it again. And the last but not least, do not modify or remove any data from database in seeds file. Seeds are meant to grow things, not delete them or destroy them. So there is a different place in which we should put such a code. Yes, and testing again, right? In this case, I think it is worth to test your seed files to just be sure when you run them on migration you are sleeping well and don't risk any data inconsistencies, etc. So I highly recommend writing some tests that ensure the idempotence of seed files. And yeah, I think that's it. This is how you can call loading seeds from within a code. So it's highly useful when you are actually testing them. And the last thing are data fixes. So data fixes are meant to delete or modify existing data. It's usually after our data loses integrity, or we broke something a while ago, or our code was breaking something for a while. Then we need to fix it somehow. So you could put it in migration, right? But migration is not meant for that. Seeds obviously is not. So we need to have a special place in which we could run this kind of thing. And data fixes are cool because they abstract this mechanism a bit. So data fixes are obviously something that's dangerous, because we run them against our production database, so we are messing around with something that's probably worth a bit. So I think that ensuring a proper test coverage here is very important, and I wouldn't run a migration that doesn't have it. I mean, this kind of migration, right? What else? Before any data fix is applied, it is very recommended to perform some backup on the database that you will be performing or applying a data fix to. And that's I think that's important in this case. And I was mentioning that I did mention that it gives you a kind of layer of abstraction here, and there are two gems that are worth mentioning here, like Case Commons Datafix and Liakat's Data Migrate. Both of those add you a couple of rake tasks that allow you to migrate up and down, so revert your datafix or apply it. And they have a couple of neat generators that will bring you some placeholders in place in which you can just place your code. Great. Okay, thank you guys.